of Moscow was one of the defining engagements of the World War II. It marked the first major defeat of the German army, shattering the myth of its invincibility. The battle spanned vast territories across the Moscow, Tula, Kaluga, Smolensk and other regions, and its outcome shaped the course of the war. September 1941 – Preparing for Operation Typhoon. In September 1941, the German High Command finalized preparation for Operation Typhoon, the plan to capture Moscow. The objective was to encircle and destroy the Soviet Western Reserve and Bryansk fronts, followed by a rapid advance to the Soviet capital. The German Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, comprised approximately 1.9 million troops, 78 divisions, 1,700 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces and 950 aircraft. Cartographically, Soviet forces, weakened by summer defeats, held defensive lines along the Rzhev-Vyazma-Bryansk axis, but their forces were overstretched and reserves were limited. Army Group Center finalized its concentration around Smolensk and Vyazma, approximately 200 km from Moscow. October 1941 – the launch of Operation Typhoon and encirclement of the Soviet forces. On October 2, 1941, German forces launched Operation Typhoon with a massive offensive against Soviet positions. Central Sector, Vyazma. The 3rd and 4th Panzer armies, under Hoth and Hopner, struck from Dukhovshchina and Roslavl. By October 7th, they closed a pincer around Soviet forces near Vyazma, 200 km from Moscow. The Vyazma pocket trapped units of the Western and Reserve fronts, approximately 500,000 troops. The Germans advanced 150–200 km in a week. Northern flank, Kalinin. The 9th Army and the 3rd Panzer Group advanced toward Rzhev and Kalinin, now Tver. The German offensive formed an arc from Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south. The distance to Moscow shrank to 140–180 km in some sectors. The Soviet command urgently formed the Mozhaivsk defensive line and charged on the cities of Volokholamsk, Mozhaivsk, Maloyaroslavets and Kaluga. By October 10, the Germans seized Kaluga, 160 km southwest of Moscow, and reached Maloyaroslavets. On October 20, German forward units approached the Istra Reservoir and Narofominsk, 70 km from Moscow. However, Soviet resistance on the Mozhaivsk line and autumn rains slowed the Germans' advance. November 1941 – the climax of the German offensive. In November, the German command made a final push to capture Moscow before the winter. After regrouping, Army Group Center resumed its offensive on November 15, along 3 main axes. Northwest, Klin, Solnechnogorsk. 3rd Panzer Army advanced from Kalinin through Klin, 85 km from Moscow. By November 24, the Germans captured Klin and reached Solnechnogorsk, 65 km from Moscow. Threatening Dmitrov and the Moscow-Volga Canal, the Germans advanced 100 km in 10 days. Center, Istra, Narofominsk. Hopna 4th Panzer Army attacked the Western Front near the Istra Reservoir. By November 27, the Germans captured Istra, 50 km from Moscow, but they were halted at the Kubinka-Narofominsk line. Their advance covered about 50 km. South, Tula. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army attempted to outflank Moscow from the south via Tula. On November 18, the Germans launched an assault on Tula, but the city held firm under the defense of the 50th Army, General Baldin. By November 25, Guderian reached Kashira, 110 kilometers from Moscow, but further progress was stopped. German forces approached Moscow to within 25-30 kilometers in the northwest, near Khimki and Krasnogorsk, and 50-60 kilometers in the west, Kubinka. The front line formed an arc from Dmitro in the north through Istra and Narofominsk to Kashira in the south. Despite heavy losses, Soviet forces held key defensive nodes and reinforcements from Siberia and the Far East began arriving by late November. By November 30, the German offensive stalled. Rasputitsa gave way to freezing temperatures, equipment failed, and German supply lines faltered. The Soviet command prepared for a counteroffensive. December 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive. On December 5-6, 1941, Soviet forces of the Western, Kalinin and Southwestern fronts, under the overall command of General Zhukov, launched a massive counteroffensive. This marked the turning point of the Battle of Moscow. Soviet forces numbered approximately 1.1 million troops, 7,650 artillery pieces, 774 tanks and 1,000 aircraft. The main counterattack directions were north, Kalinin-Klin. The Kalinin front of the General Konev began its offensive on Kalinin on December 5. By December 16, the city was liberated and German forces were pushed back to Rzhev, 220 kilometers from Moscow. Soviet troops advanced 100-120 kilometers northwest, Klin, Solnechnogorsk. The Western Front struck the German 3rd Panzer Army. Klin was liberated by December 12 and Solnechnogorsk by December 15. The Germans retreated to Volokholamsk, 120 kilometers from Moscow, losing 50-70 kilometers of territory. Center, Narofominsk, Kubinka. Soviet forces expelled the German from Narofominsk December 20 and pushed them back to Mozhaisk, 110 kilometers from Moscow. The advance covered 40-50 kilometers. South, Tula, Kaluga. The Southwestern Front, Marshal Timoshenko, launched an offensive from Tula on December 8. By December 25, Kaluga was liberated and the Germans were driven back to Yukhno. Soviet troops advanced 80-100 kilometers. The front line was pushed back 100-250 kilometers from Moscow by late December. The Germans lost the initiative, suffering losses of 400,000 personnel, 1,300 tanks and 2,500 artillery pieces. January-April 1942. Conclusion and front stabilization. In January 1942, Soviet forces continued their offensive, aiming to destroy Army Group Center entirely. January. Soviet troops liberated Mozhaisk and reached Gzhatsk, 160 kilometers from Moscow. In the south, Sukhinichi, 250 kilometers from Moscow, was freed. However, German forces entrenched along the Rzhev-Vyazma-Yukhnov line, forming a fortified position. February-March. The Soviet offensive slowed due to depleted reserves and fierce German resistance. The front stabilized 150-250 kilometers from Moscow. The Germans held the Rzhev salient, 200 kilometers from Moscow, which remained a focal point of intense fighting until 1943. April. The Soviet offensive concluded. The Battle of Moscow officially ended. Tough localized fighting persisted. Soviet forces pushed the Germans 150-300 kilometers from Moscow, regaining control of key cities Kalinin, Klin, Tula and Kaluga. The total liberated area spanned approximately 40,000 square kilometers. Outcomes and significance. The Battle of Moscow was the first strategic defeat of the Wehrmacht in World War II. German forces, which had advanced 600-700 kilometers from their starting positions in June 1941, were halted 25-30 kilometers from the Soviet capital and driven back 150-300 kilometers. Despite heavy losses, around 1 million personnel, Soviet forces preserved Moscow and seized the strategic initiative.